When I reset the wagon tires last week, I mentioned that I also had a pair of fairly light cart wheels that I need to put new channel and rubber on, and I want to kind of tie that project up today. And when they came in, they had the old original channel on them. I did take a wire brush and try to clean them up, but you can see they're really deeply pitted and really rough, really sharp corners on the legs of this channel. And as if you have watched the process of putting hard rubber tires on before, this rubber has to slide on this surface. And this old iron makes that really difficult. And on wheels such as these, they're still original, and when this wood gets this old, it has a tendency to become a little more brittle. It loses its vibrancy. So this wood is a little more tender and it's narrow. They only have 1-inch spokes, and they have fellows that are 1 inch. So I don't like to put a lot of stress on these wheels through the process of putting the rubber tires on. And through that process, I use this machine here, and you've seen that I have to overlap my rubber, but in the process of welding those 2 wires that are inside the rubber, I have to pull that rubber back, and then I kind of scrub it on the floor to bring that back together. Well, through that process, if these old wheels are given too much abuse, I can break a spoke, and that's not something that I want to do. So I do keep some 1-inch channel here to replace this instead of a 1/2-inch leg, which is most common at your steel yards. This is specially made for rubber tires, and it has only a 3/8 leg. These are 34-inch wheels, so I want that curve to kind of match that arc. We're pretty close. So this kind of helps me set my roller spacings so I get my diameters correct, or somewhere close. I've got these both just a fuzz under, which I'd rather have them just a hair small than too big. This is flexible enough, it'll spring right out there. So when I'm measuring circumference to undersize the steel tire, you all know that the rule of thumb is 0.2% underneath the circumference, which is all the way around, not diameter. 34-inch wheel, this comes out to about a strong 3/16, but a little older wood, I'm going to do it at 3/16, maybe even just a hair light. So I just count my revolutions. Each white spoke is 24 inches. So there's 3, 4 revolutions. Then bring my pointer down to where it is 3/16 undersize. You know, everything I work on here is not metric. But I finally got a chance to use a metric wrench on a buggy wheel. These 3/16 tire bolts generally take a square nut that fits a 3/8 wrench. But because there is still old paint on here, that 3/8 wrench doesn't fit, so I stepped it up to use a 10mm. A metric wrench. So all of you that give me such a hard time about not being metric, I'm using a metric wrench. Aha. This might be the first buggy wheel I've ever put a metric wrench on. And in 45 years of being in the wheelwright trade, that's quite a statement. Now, I don't want to confess how long I've had these wheels, but I will confess I was pretty surprised I still found those old felly plates with the old nuts. I'm pretty impressed. Well, you can see from the old channel that came off of these two cartwheels that these originally had rubber tires. Rubber tires is not a modern innovation. In fact, in Don Berkebile's book called The Carriage Terminology, he attributes that rubber tires were first started around that 1865 era in England. And I've seen it in catalogs as early as 1901 over here. It may have started sooner than that, I don't know. But out here in the western part of the country, rubber tires weren't all that common because we mainly had dirt roads. It's my understanding that rubber tires were brought into the picture mainly because of cobblestone streets. So in the US here, they were more of an East Coast accommodation than it was out here in the West. Well, there are some well-known names that we're familiar with when it comes to automobile tires, and one of those is Goodyear. Well, years ago, I took apart a set of buggy wheels that had rubber tires on them. They were original, and guess what? They had Goodyear on them. I saved a section of that rubber tire because it was such in good condition, but here you can see the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, Akron, Ohio. It has a little different configuration of what is commonly on the market today, but it still had two holes to accommodate the wires that went through the center of this rubber, and that's what keeps it on the wheels. So this is the hard rubber that I'm going to install, and it still takes the two wires, but the outside corners are a little different. This recessed up against the legs of the channel, and then the rubber was inset. This design here is actually for the rubber to come out flush with the outside edge of the legs of the channel. There are different options for different styles out there. This is what I have used for years, and this is what I keep on hand. So this sets right down inside the channel iron, and it is a common concept that rubber tires must be stretched like an O-ring over the wheel, when in fact it is not stretched, it's actually compressed. So as I wrap the rubber tire around just in a loose fashion, I'm going to add another 6 inches in overlap, so there's actually too much rubber to fit on this wheel. But the process of putting the wires through the holes will compress this back on itself, and that tension will actually keep this joint tight. Kind of loosely fit this around the channel. You can see that overlap that we're going to have. So we actually have too much rubber for the circumference of the wheel. So the wire that's inserted in this rubber is about an 1/8 inch. It's like number 9 wire, but it's a high carbon, high tensile strength wire. And these thread right through the center of this rubber. So this whole contraption is what I use to put the rubber tires on. This first jaw here is meant to clamp the short end of these wires, and I do stagger them so that when I do the brazing that they don't just stand opposite each other, but they're kind of staggered. And then the other ends, which are much longer, are going to go through the second set of jaws. Then there's a couple holes designed above the first set of wires on the first jaw that they can bypass each other, kind of like so. Then I have two of these hand cranks, and both of them have a hole in the center. I have a right hand and a left hand, and then these wires will get threaded through those holes. One through the front one and one through the back one. So when we're done, the rubber will butt up against this jaw on the short end, and then on the long end, the rubber will butt up against this jaw, keeping these two ends of the rubber apart, which allows the brazing welding to happen on these two. So on this 34-inch wheel, there's roughly about 9 feet of circumference around it. Well, I have 14 feet of wire, so I have quite a little bit left over that I'll just trim off. And that'll allow me to start to wrap around these hand cranks and cinch this wire up. So since we already have too much rubber by an extra 6 inches, and then we have another 8 inches spread out, when I put this wheel up here, it's going to look really loose. I'm going to cinch this up to the jaws, so you can see how loose this rubber is going to be around the wheel. So the process of winding these wires up will actually cause compression in this rubber. And you can see it's bringing the rubber up into the wheel. So while it's a little bit loose yet, I just bring it up kind of loose by itself, and I'm going to clamp it in place here. So the excess will be in this area of the wheel, which will help this rubber to slide forward when I get it off of the jaws and actually meet these two ends up so that it'll keep that joint together. That's settled in there nice and tight. So this is where I kind of tune my guitar, so to speak. I want fairly consistent pitches between the two wires. So then when I work this back wheel, it pulls both wires up equally. And I can check my pitch. So then the wires were able to slide through this second jaw, but now that I have them tensioned up, I'm going to clamp it down on the other end of the wire. So now both jaws are holding the wire securely. But there is still tension here to my cranks. So I can bring these two jaws out, which will bring these in and take the tension off of this wire here, but yet these two jaws will hold that tension. where eventually we shouldn't have any tension on this wheel here anymore. So now the tension is just between the two jaws and not here. I can take and cut these two wires, and I'm going to leave them overlapped by about 3/4 of an inch, but these joints will be staggered. Pull that other wire out. With a little heat, I can get these to lay beside each other, get them ready to braze. Don't want to take them up too hot, just enough to kind of relax them. Well, like so. I'll just let that cool down naturally. Now it can be a temptation to spray this with a tire lube or whatever you lube it with, but that is a detrimental thing to this because it is a high carbon, high tensile strength wire, and it actually will cause it to be brittle and will increase the likelihood that that wire will break. So it's been, I don't know, 10 minutes maybe. You want these cold enough that there's basically no heat. There's no danger leaving your hands on there. So if I were just to kick these two jaws loose, it would shock load that joint. So I'm going to take the tension off of the jaws slowly by this wheel up here, which is going to release the tension here, so we're pretty free there. So when I release these jaws, it doesn't have that shock effect. Now it should just slide right out of the jaws. So when I clamped this rubber here and made the excess go in this area, this is where the biggest amount of compression is. So when I take and scrub it on the floor here, you can see I've done it many, many times, that compression will release and bring these two joints together. You can see the rubber coming up. It has one weld covered. As it's closing up against the second one, will eventually close up. Almost there. There we go. Yeah, one down, one to go. So we're finding out that so many principles that we take for granted today in our automobile industry really started in the horse and buggy era. You know, the Timken roller bearings, the caster camber gather swing, and in this case, the rubber tires. The rubber tires started out in the horse-drawn era to accommodate cobblestone streets. and this was the process of how it was installed. Some of the techniques may have varied over time, but this brazing the wire concept is what has lasted over all these years. Appreciate you coming along. Thanks for watching.